He was the CEO. He was the boss. But when he walked into his own store undercover, he didn't expect to be treated like this. One employee's shocking refusal would expose much more than just bad customer service. James Carter was not the typical CEO. He was a man of power, yes, but also a man who had earned his position through grit, resilience, and an unshakable belief in equality. The black man who had risen to the top in an industry that was dominated by those who had never experienced the struggles he had. Carter had always been an enigma, a CEO who refused to live behind the walls of his office, who understood that true leadership required an understanding of the people at every level of his company. But there was one thing that always nagged at him: the disconnect. His company was a well-known luxury retail brand, known for its upscale stores that catered to a specific type of clientele. A clientele that could afford the lavish prices, that could walk in without hesitation and demand the best. But while the customers received the red carpet treatment, Carter couldn't help but wonder if his employees, those who worked behind the scenes, truly felt respected. Did they truly understand the values he held? Or was it just a performance for the customer's eyes? His days were often spent in high-rise offices, board meetings, and financial reports, but he longed for a way to reconnect with the heart of his business. The sales floor, the people who interacted with customers every day. He knew the success of his company depended on how well his employees understood its mission. But how could he know what was truly happening in his stores, behind the polished counters and perfect displays? And so, Carter made a decision. He would go undercover. He would disguise himself as just another customer, blending in with the rest. He would walk through the doors of his own store, unseen, unnoticed, to see firsthand how the workers treated the customers, how they interacted with the brand, and how they saw the company that he had built. It was a test, one that would reveal more than he could have anticipated. But what he didn't expect was to experience what would be the most shocking moment of his entire career. On the day he chose to carry out his plan, he arrived at the store early in the morning, before the rush. Dressed in plain clothes, with no indication of his status, he strolled into the high-end location with the same look of a regular customer, browsing through the designer collections. No one knew who he was, and no one paid him a second glance. He didn't want them to. Carter's heart raced slightly as he observed the sleek, upscale environment. The air was crisp with luxury, but behind the polished surfaces, there was an atmosphere that felt detached, even cold. The employees moved like cogs in a machine, focused on their tasks, but hardly engaged with the customers or each other. The store felt more like a well-oiled machine than a place driven by purpose or connection. As he moved through the aisles, Carter noticed a young woman at the counter, busy assisting a customer with a high-end handbag. Her professionalism was undeniable, but something about her energy seemed off. She appeared distant, uninterested even. Carter couldn't help but notice the lack of personal connection in her service. He approached her casually, inquiring about a luxury watch he had his eye on, hoping for some insight. But as soon as he asked, her response was cold, mechanical. She barely looked at him as she gave her answer, only nodding toward the price tag, without offering any further help. It was then that Carter realized this wasn't just about customer service. There was a deeper disconnect here, a sense that something was missing, something more than just professionalism. It was the human touch, the empathy, the understanding that the company's success wasn't just about the products, but about the people who walked through those doors every single day. But what truly struck him was the quiet, unnoticed figure watching him from across the floor. A young man who had been stationed near the display case. His eyes were sharp, observant. Carter noticed that the man seemed to have recognized him. Their eyes locked for a brief second, before the young man quickly looked away, a nervous energy rippling through him. Carter thought little of it at first, chalking it up to coincidence. But little did he know that one subtle glance would set the stage for everything that was about to unfold. With a sigh, Carter turned to continue his exploration of the store, unaware that the very next moment would change the course of his entire plan. James Carter had expected the usual: salespeople doing their job, customers wandering the aisles, the hum of commerce in the background. But nothing prepared him for what was about to happen. He had been walking through the aisles for nearly an hour, quietly observing, trying to piece together the missing element. His mind was racing with questions. Was there a deeper issue here? Something that went beyond a simple lack of engagement? The employees moved in robotic patterns, like well-trained machines, who had learned exactly what to do, but not why they were doing it. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to sell luxury. It had to be about the experience, the culture, the care. That's when it happened. He was standing in front of a display of high-end leather goods when he overheard a voice behind him. A sharp voice, one that didn't belong to the luxury surroundings, cutting through the otherwise silent store. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" It wasn't the tone he had been expecting. It wasn't polite or welcoming. It was dismissive, cold. James turned around slowly. There, standing a few feet away, was the same young woman from the counter. Her eyes met his, but this time, something in them was different. She wasn't giving him the routine customer service smile, the one that they all wore like a uniform. No, this look was different, almost sneering, like she had already sized him up and found him lacking. "I'm just browsing," James said calmly, doing his best to maintain a neutral tone. "I wanted to take a look at these bags." The woman barely acknowledged his request. She let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh and flicked her wrist, motioning toward the bags. "Everything's pretty standard, just like what you see in the catalog," she said, her voice still dripping with disinterest. There was a pause as she stared at him, almost daring him to say something. Carter's mind spun, 1,000 thoughts racing. She wasn't just disinterested, she was dismissive. And then, like a strange instinct, he decided to press further. "Actually, I'm looking for something more unique," he said, trying to engage her. "Something a bit more exclusive, maybe even one of your limited editions." A brief flicker of surprise crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "We don't have anything like that here. You'd need to check with the manager about the high-end selections," she replied curtly. That's when it hit him. She wasn't just a disengaged employee. She was actively undermining the store's image, undermining what the company stood for. James had seen the signs before in corporate cultures, when people didn't just neglect their job, but sabotaged the very mission of the business. This wasn't just about her laziness or lack of training. This was deeper. His patience, usually his greatest asset, began to wear thin. He asked to speak with the manager, his tone now sharper, and the woman, showing no hesitation, led him to the back of the store where the manager was speaking with another customer. James waited silently, observing everything. The manager, a middle-aged man with a tired look in his eyes, greeted the woman with an almost exaggerated politeness. As if on cue, the woman gave her account of the interaction. She spoke with a tone that suggested James was some kind of nuisance, that he didn't belong there. He just didn't seem like the type who could afford anything in the store, she added, glancing over at him dismissively. The manager turned to James, his expression unchanging, and said, "I'm afraid we don't have any exclusive items available at the moment, sir. Perhaps you'd like to check the catalog online." James couldn't believe what was happening. His own employees, people he trusted to represent his company, were openly disregarding the idea of customer service. Worse, they were judging him, an unseen figure, a man who had spent his life building this company, solely on his appearance. It wasn't just a rejection of him. It was a rejection of what he had worked so hard to build, a rejection of the very principles that had driven him to succeed. His heart pounded in his chest. It was clear now. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a deep-seated issue. The type of company he had founded, the type of values he had instilled, were being trampled by ignorance, by people who thought they knew more than they did. The manager's dismissive tone made everything clear. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a company-wide culture problem, a culture that was falling apart. James felt his breath catch in his throat, his anger building. He had hoped for better. He had wanted to believe that the business he had built was full of people who shared his vision, who worked toward the same goals. But here, in front of him, was proof that some of his employees didn't care at all. The twist was coming, and he knew it. The real test had just begun. But first, he had to decide how to handle the situation. Would he confront them now, or would he let them continue to believe that they had the upper hand? James stood still in the back of the store, the hum of conversation and the rustling of high-end fabrics around him feeling like a distant noise now. His mind raced, his thoughts spiraling. The very employees he had hired, the people he had put in place to represent his company's values, were dismissing not only the brand he had built, but the very ideals he had worked his entire life to instill. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't. This moment, this scenario, was far from over. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Something needed to change, and fast. The manager's eyes flickered toward him, a mix of uncertainty and unease in his gaze, as he realized the tension in the air. He had no idea that the man he had been speaking to was the CEO himself, the one person who could have solved all of the problems he was currently facing with a simple word. The young woman who had initially brushed him off, the one who had decided he didn't belong in the store, was now standing quietly to the side, her arms crossed defensively. She glanced nervously at her co-workers, as though expecting someone to step in, but no one did. James exhaled slowly, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. The silence stretched on, a quiet tension building with every passing second. He looked over at the young woman who had dismissed him, his gaze calm yet sharp. He could sense the discomfort radiating from her. Her eyes kept darting around, from him to the manager, then to the other employees who were watching the scene unfold. James had the power to call this moment out, to expose her for what she had done, but he wasn't going to do it just yet. No, this was a lesson, both for her and for him. "Tell me something," James finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you believe in this brand? Do you believe in what we stand for?" The young woman blinked, caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth to respond, but faltered, unsure of how to handle the moment. I do, sir. Of course I do," she stammered, her tone defensive now. James could see right through it. She didn't believe a word of it. He knew the truth. She didn't care about the brand. She didn't care about the customers. She didn't even care about her job. And most importantly, she didn't care about him. Not as the CEO, not as the man who had built the company she worked for. The silence lingered for a few more moments, heavy and thick, before the manager spoke again, his voice low. "Sir, I'm sure we can resolve this issue. Let me show you something from our catalog," the manager offered awkwardly, trying to change the subject. He motioned toward the nearby counter, clearly uncomfortable. James shook his head. "No," he said firmly, his tone steady. "This isn't about a catalog. This is about something bigger, something that's been brewing for a while now." The tension was palpable. The young woman and the manager exchanged glances, their unease growing with every second. Other employees on the floor had begun to notice the change in the atmosphere. Some of them seemed to feel the pressure in the air, while others remained oblivious, continuing their tasks with the same mechanical focus. "Let me make myself clear," James continued, his voice gaining strength. "I came here today as a customer. I came here to see how you would treat me, to see if you truly believe in the mission of this company. What I saw was a failure of culture, a failure of service, and most of all, a failure of respect." The words hung in the air, each one more cutting than the last. James wasn't angry, not yet. He wasn't throwing accusations. He was pointing out a truth they could no longer ignore. He had already seen what he needed to see. The systems were broken, the people were disconnected, and the values that had once driven this company were now an afterthought. The young woman's face flushed with embarrassment as the weight of his words settled over her. She tried to speak, but the words didn't come. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the manager, silently pleading for help. The manager, looking increasingly nervous, stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Sir, please, if you'd just let us show you the catalog." James raised a hand to silence him. "No more catalogs, no more excuses. I don't need to see anything else. What I need to know is why someone who works for this company would think it's okay to treat a customer this way. Why would anyone think it's okay to judge someone by their appearance and assume they don't belong? Because let me tell you, that's not just about bad service. That's about something much deeper. And if that's the culture we're fostering here, then we've got a much bigger problem on our hands." The store was quiet now. Every eye in the room was on him. James could feel their gazes, the mixture of confusion, fear, and curiosity. No one dared to speak. Everyone had fallen silent, awaiting whatever would come next. Even the young woman seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "This isn't just about today," James added, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is about the bigger picture. If this is how we treat people, if this is how we make judgments about others, then we need to take a long, hard look at what we're doing here. And that starts with you. You." He pointed to the young woman, who flinched slightly. "Need to understand that you're not just selling bags or watches. You're selling an experience. You're representing this brand, and what you do here affects every person who walks through these doors. If you can't get that, then maybe it's time to rethink your position." The words hung in the air, unspoken for a moment, before they began to sink in. James was done with words. He had given them the opportunity to show him they could rise to the occasion. But the time for talk was over. He knew what had to be done, and the decision would come soon, but not just yet. Not while the truth was still unfolding. The air in the store seemed to freeze as James Carter stood there, his words hanging heavily in the room. The young woman, still standing with her arms crossed defensively, glanced nervously at the manager. The other employees had stopped what they were doing. their eyes now fixed on the scene unfolding before them. It was clear now. Something was about to change. James could feel the weight of their stares, but he remained calm. The truth had been laid bare, and it was time for the reckoning. But then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, James took a step back and glanced around the room. He could see it now, more clearly than ever. The way the employees had been treating the customers, the disinterest in their jobs, the indifference to the values he had instilled in the company. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was a systemic problem, a failure that went beyond a single employee. This wasn't just about a refusal of service. It was about a culture of complacency that had taken root in the company, and now it was time to deal with it. "All right," James said, his voice calm but firm. "You all want to know who I am, don't you?" The silence grew even thicker, the employees exchanging uneasy glances. The young woman shifted her weight, her eyes darting from James to the manager, her expression turning from defiance to confusion. The manager stepped forward hesitantly, as if trying to gauge where this was heading, but James raised his hand, stopping him. "I'm not here to make a scene," James continued, his eyes scanning the room. "But I will tell you one thing. I am the one who signs your paychecks. I am the CEO of this company, and everything that you've just witnessed, the poor service, the disrespect, the complete disregard for the values we claim to uphold, it's unacceptable." A shocked gasp rippled through the room as the employees' faces went pale. The young woman's mouth dropped open, her hands suddenly trembling at her sides. She had no idea who James was. None of them did. They had judged him based on his appearance, assuming he was just another customer. But now, the truth hit them like a thunderclap. The man they had dismissed was the very one who held the keys to their future. The manager stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're the CEO?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," James said, his tone still measured, but now laced with a quiet fury. "I'm the CEO, and I've been watching everything you've done here today. I've been listening, observing, and what I've seen is disappointing, to say the least." The young woman stepped forward now, her face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't know," she mumbled, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" James interrupted, his voice sharp. "You didn't mean to treat a customer like dirt because you assumed they couldn't afford anything in this store? You didn't mean to make judgments based on appearance? That's not just bad customer service. That's discrimination, and I won't stand for it." The weight of his words hung in the air, as if time had slowed down. The young woman seemed to shrink. Her shoulders slumped as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The other employees were silent, staring at the ground, too ashamed to meet his eyes. James let the silence linger, allowing the tension to build even further. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He was the CEO, and this moment needed to be about more than just reprimanding an employee. It needed to be about setting an example. It was time to show everyone in that room what leadership truly meant. He took a deep breath, then looked directly at the young woman. "You're not the only one responsible for this. This is a failure of leadership, of training, of respect. You're just a symptom of a much larger problem in this company." The manager seemed to snap out of his daze, his face turning red as he began to apologize. "I'm sorry, sir. This won't happen again. I swear, I'll handle it." James held up a hand, silencing him. "It's too late for apologies. I came here to see the truth, and I've seen it. And now, I have to make a decision." The room was still, every eye on James as he looked around at the employees who had once made him proud. Now, they were no more than a reflection of the deeper issues in his company, issues that needed to be addressed, and fast. This company is built on respect, on inclusivity, and on valuing every customer that walks through our doors. If you can't embody those values, then you have no place here. I've seen enough. James turned to the manager. You're fired. The words hit the room like a bombshell. The young woman gasped, her face pale, as she looked from the manager to James. The manager stood frozen for a moment, his face going white as the weight of the decision sunk in. He had no words. There was nothing left to say. James didn't care about apologies. He cared about making the right call. You're done here, James said firmly. And as for the rest of you, I hope you take a long, hard look at what this company is about. Because if you're not up to the task, don't bother showing up tomorrow. With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the store, his decision made. The storm had passed, but its impact would be felt long after he was gone. The employees were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered assumptions. The young woman stood there, trembling, as the reality of what had just happened began to set in. And as James Carter left the store, he knew that this was just the beginning of the change that was coming. The store was left in stunned silence. The door closed with a soft chime behind James as he exited, and for several long moments, no one dared to move. The young woman stood frozen, her eyes still wide with shock, while the other employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. The reality of what had just occurred was beginning to sink in, and it felt like a weight too heavy to carry. In the back of the store, the manager stood with his hands trembling at his sides, his mind racing. He had never imagined such a confrontation. He had heard of CEO visits before, but never like this. Never this harsh. Never this real. The man he had casually dismissed had just fired him. And it wasn't just his job on the line. It was his career, his reputation, and his integrity. The sense of defeat washed over him like a tidal wave. But as the shock began to settle, something else started to stir in the employees. A shift, slow but palpable, started to creep into the atmosphere. The young woman who had initially dismissed James was now looking around at her co-workers with a sense of guilt. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But deep down, she knew she had been complicit in the culture that had allowed this behavior to fester. She had ignored the values the company was supposed to represent, and now the cost was clear. Is he really gone? One of the employees whispered, their voice shaky. The others nodded, though no one seemed to know what to say next. For the next few hours, the store was a different place. The once bustling space of luxury goods now felt hollow, as if the walls themselves were witnessing the unraveling of something far greater than a simple reprimand. The employees worked quietly, no longer just performing tasks. They were reflecting on what had just happened and the consequences of their actions. The store, once a place where the brand's values were only ever performed, now had to confront them head-on. The young woman who had initially refused to help James was now at the counter, head lowered, unable to face the others. The apology she had tried to offer was no longer enough. It wasn't about a simple mistake. It was about understanding the weight of her actions, the disregard for another human being. And though no words were exchanged between the employees, the lesson had been learned, whether they wanted it or not. By the end of the day, the store had changed. The manager was gone, fired, and the young woman was left to confront her choices. But in that silence, in that aftermath, there was also a quiet realization. James had left a legacy, not just in his company, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed the truth. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a culture shift, one that had been long overdue. And as the doors to the store closed for the night, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, the store opened its doors with an air of quiet transformation. The employees moved through their tasks with a newfound sense of purpose. There was no grand announcement or dramatic speech. Instead, there was a subtle shift, a shared understanding that they were part of something much bigger than just a place to work. They were now part of a culture that demanded respect, dignity, and the recognition of every individual. James Carter never returned to that store. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered, not just through words, but through action. It wasn't about the power he wielded, the money he had, or the position he held. It was about the integrity he stood for, the responsibility he took for the company's culture. It was about knowing when to stand up for what was right, even when it meant making difficult decisions. As he sat in his office later that day, reviewing reports, James reflected on the events that had unfolded. There were no cheers or celebrations, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that change had been set in motion. The employees would never forget that day, and neither would he. The lesson was clear. Never let anyone define your worth based on appearance or assumption. Never let complacency erode the values you stand for, and always hold yourself accountable for the culture you create. If you believe that respect and integrity should always come first, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start a conversation about what truly matters, about building a culture that values every person, no matter who they are or where they come from. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Your voice matters, and together, we can make a difference.